Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming here on a Saturday, nearly morning. Maybe a lot of you would be in bed or chilling at home, but thank you for making your way out here to listen to our panel. I hope it's worth your time. Okay. So just to introduce myself, I'm Hae-ryung Kang. I'm the managing editor of Korea Exposé, and I'll be moderating this panel. Just to give a brief introduction of the panelists today, Pastor Kim Jo-hyun is the founder of KORU, which is an adoptee organization, and he has been in adoptee activism for a long time. For how many years now?
I start to involve about adoption issues in 1993 in Switzerland, but come back to Korea 2004. Since then, I'm working for this organization.
Excellent. And Helen No, Professor Helen No is a professor of social welfare at Sungsil University, and she was also a previous employee at Holt Korea and Holt United States in the early 80s and late 80s. And finally, Caitlin Hemeke, who is an adoptee researcher who did her Fulbright on the birth family search, and she's also the co-host of this panel. So before we go into the questions, let me first describe to you the structure of the panel. We'll have maybe 40 to 50 minutes of Q&A that we've prepared for the panelists, and then we'll have a short intermission followed by an open floor to you guys where you can ask questions. So before we go into that, I want to say that obviously I'm not an adoptee. I have adoptee friends like Caitlin. I've covered adoptee stories here and there when I was working at NPR, and I've edited Caitlin's stories at Korea Exposé. But I don't know what it's like to be an adoptee, and I will never know what it's like to be an adoptee because I grew up in a normal Korean household with a mom and a dad and siblings, and I never thought that what I had was what other people couldn't have. I had a very ordinary childhood, or what South Korea thinks is ordinary and is right. And when I watched reality TV shows, do you guys know the Return of the Superman? The variety show on Korean television where fathers spend a day with their kids and you have these happy families on television. When I watch shows like that, nothing strikes me as being out of the ordinary. And it's my prejudice of what is ordinary. But then one day I was in a pub in Itaewon and I was drinking with a friend, and one of my adoptee friends started ranting about Return of the Superman. He started saying how that show is so misleadingly perfect in its portrayal of what it's like to be an ordinary family. You know, that it excludes so many people who don't fit into the standard. And that includes people whose families are divorced, people who have adoptees in their families, single moms. Single moms were actually the largest parental demographic in the international adoptee community. None of this is included in the mainstream narrative. And this is what Korea Exposé tries to do with a panel like this. We want to disrupt the mainstream narrative, and we want to pose questions about what is ordinary. And this is a very small step, but I hope that the discussions that we raise in this panel can create a tiny little rupture. So thank you for coming again. Okay. So without further ado, I will address my first question to Caitlin Hemeke, who is herself one of the 200,000 adoptees that were sent overseas since the 1950s. So Caitlin, can you tell us a little bit about your own story of adoption? How old were you when you got adopted, and what was your search process like?
So I guess I won't go too much into this now, just with personal details. But I have a very, very typical adoption story. I was adopted at 3 months old by a white family in Michigan. So I grew up in the very rural Midwest. My hometown has about 7,000 people in it. It's a farming town. So very typical in that most adoptees grow up in predominantly white communities, often rural. I guess there's a long story behind how I started becoming more educated about adoption issues in adoptee activism. I won't go into that now, but my search process, I actually very recently searched for my birth family and was able to reunite with them. So I started the search process in May 2016. And this was also a pretty typical path, I guess, in that I started with my American adoption agency, which is a small one. It's not one of the major big names that a lot of people know. So it's a small Midwestern agency. And they basically got in touch with the Korean agency. I didn't hear from them for several months, actually, after I first contacted them, but I kind of knew what to expect, so I didn't expect anything to happen very quickly. I had pretty low expectations for them, actually, but I was trying to get my file from them because I had never seen my own adoption file before. And they just told me, oh, well, we moved to a different building a long time ago. Everything got shuffled around. We don't know where it is, but we'll try to find it. But it was only a few months later, I guess in August, I had just come to Korea to start my Fulbright research grant, and I got in touch with the American agency to follow up with them and just say, hey, I'm in Korea now. If you don't have my file, could I please go to the Korean agency, which I was adopted through Korea Social Services, KSS, which is no longer active, but can I go to them and get my file if you guys don't have it? And she responded right away and said, sure, I'll set up an appointment for you. But then the next email I got a few days later was, hey, this is what I got from KSS. Please read this email. And it was basically, hey, we found her birth mom. And she wants to meet you. And we set a time at this day, on this day at this time. So, yeah. So it happened pretty quickly. Yeah, it happened very quickly. So I met my birth mother last August, and then about a month after that, she connected me to my birth father. And they are not married to each other. They were never married to each other, but yeah, that's the basic details.
This is not in the sample questions, so I hope you're not too thrown off by this, but not all adoptees try to look for their birth parents. There's no precise statistics on this, but CAS released a study several years ago that estimated around 70% look for their birth parents and the rest don't. The numbers are different again. So in your case, what prompted you to want to look for your birth parents? And Professor Helen No said over lunch that, for an adoptee to look at the file, it's like kind of touching the remnant of their parents. Did you feel like that?
So this is something that I guess as I've gotten to know more adoptees, and my research project was actually an oral history project. I interviewed 30 adoptees about their birth family search process, if they had chosen to search, which not all of them had. So, on one hand, I think that this question gets asked a lot of adoptees, and I don't believe that adoptees should be, and I'm not trying to criticize you for asking the question, but I really don't believe that adoptees should be asked to justify it all the time, because a lot of time the question is asked with the expectation of oh, did you feel like a piece of you was missing? Did you feel like you were gonna find your true self? And that's just evidence of the way that the kind of dominant adoption narrative has been set up, in that there's a lot of stigma actually around searching for a birth family, and that, well, if an adoptee chooses to search for their birth family, they must have some kind of issue that they need to resolve, or they must be looking for some kind of closure on, something they've got going on. So there's a lot of stigma around that. But for me personally, I chose to search for my birth family because as I got my master's in literature, and my thesis was about adoptee memoir. And so, I was studying literature, but I was also reading a lot about the history of adoption and the politics of international adoption. And so as I was learning more about that, I learned for the first time how the vast majority, probably, of adoptions were not the typical story that most adoptees, like myself, were told by their adoptive families, which is the story of, your mom was young and unmarried, and she wanted to give you a better life, so she bravely made this decision because she loved you so much to give you up. And I learned through my research that that's usually not the case, that single mothers are often pressured or coerced into giving up their children even when they don't want to. And so I realized that I might be perfectly fine never meeting my birth family. Maybe, if I never know who they are or what they're doing, or, maybe that's okay with me. But what if my birth mom is out there and she never wanted to give me up and she wonders what happened to me? Or it was never her choice to give me up. What if that was the case? And so that's kind of what prompted me to search. And that turned out to be the case. My birth mother and birth father, their parents did not want them to be together, even before my birth mother got pregnant. So I was born quite premature, so I was very small. So basically, as I understand it, my birth grandparents lied to my birth parents and said, oh, the baby didn't survive. She died after she was born. So my parents had no idea that I was alive. They had no idea that I had been adopted. It was not their choice. So.
Thank you for sharing that. And I am glad that I asked the question, even though this is something.
Yeah, that was not a criticism.
For adoptees who search for their birth parents and birth families, the overwhelming majority of them do it through adoption agencies. And there's a few minority that use the police or media, but usually it's through adoption agencies. And Helen, you've worked as a social worker at Holt in South Korea from 1981 to 1982, and in Holt, USA, from 1986 to 1987. And Holt was and is one of the leading agencies in international and domestic adoption in South Korea. So can you tell us, in your experience, how do you remember working at the agency? What was the agency like, and how much do you think it has changed now to help adoptees find families more effectively?
Well, when I worked for Holt, 1981, there were very few social welfare agencies. Adoption agencies were some of the few that existed. And I worked at the overseas adoption department. So Holt was one of the largest agencies. So our departments were all divided into different tasks. So I really did not have a chance to meet with birth parents, or there was a department taking care of the children in foster care or working with child welfare institutions, intaking from institutions. And there was sponsorship department, translation department. So it was all divided into different tasks. So what I did in the overseas adoption department was mainly getting papers of children from the foster care and institution department, and also getting home studies from adoption agencies in the US and matching them. And also, at the time, adoptive parents didn't have to come to Korea to adopt a child. It was all done through, paperwork. Holt wasn't involved until 2013. Was it? Special law came into effect 2013. Come to Korea. 13, yeah. So before that, they didn't have to come.
So just to reiterate, the special law is the revisions that were implemented to the adoption law in 2013, and this law made a lot of effective 2012, but practically. Gotcha. So to go back to your experiences in Holt.
So it was all done through mail. It was more administration, but I did get to see how adoption agencies worked through home studies, partly, and adoption workers from different agencies. I worked with 8 agencies in the U.S., and they would come. And sometimes few adoptive parents would come to pick up their children. So I got to be friends with them. I still am good friends with some of them. And as for post-adoption services, we would sometimes get letters asking for background information, but very few still, 1981.
Background information
Adoptees or birth parent search. But you have to remember the most number of children left Korea in 1985. That's almost 9,000. So it just number increased rapidly. So I think it was only in 1970s they started going in thousands. Before that was less. So they were not old enough to search for parents. Only a few would do that. So at the time when we get letters like that, we would search into file. We would write. I don't remember just writing anything like that, but sometimes I remember going to the files and then usually I think there were some phone calls I would answer, but I don't remember actually writing anything and sending it. So, compared to now, there was really very little birth parent search.
One thing that is put in the mainstream narrative when it comes to overseas adoption is that Korea was poor in the 50s and 60s, and these parents couldn't feed their children, so they sent their kids abroad. But if you look at the statistics, actually the peak of adoption was in the 80s when you were working at Holt and when Korea's economy was developing. What is this difference between the narrative and the statistics? Can you tell us why this peaked in the 80s?
Because I was part of Holt then, I didn't see the whole picture of what was happening, but becoming a scholar in adoption and looking at the figures, I was surprised myself. But it was like almost considered like immigration policy in 1980s. Yeah, like the government thought it was a good way for people to emigrate to other country. Yeah, and you have, especially during Chonduan regime.
In the 1980s.
Yeah, and I think adoption agencies won't like hearing it, but was a lot of money involved. In 1981, when I was working at Holt, for one child, the agency was receiving $3,000. I remember checking if the money was in. And if you multiply that by the number of children, that's a lot of money, especially at that time.
Do you know approximately how many children?
Well, now it's 20,000, so... Oh, how many children? Well, several thousand. I know in 1985 it's 8,000 some children. Yeah. So, with the backing of the government, there is no reason why the adoption agency would not do it. Well, there's plenty of reason, but they weren't the agency, I remember, it was a good place for social work graduates to go because there were very few, and we had very good, working condition compared to other places, because agencies were doing very well financially. We were never educated about adoption issues. I did not receive one education, one training about adoption issues. So we were just doing it what we were told to do. And the pressure, I didn't get any pressure because I was at overseas adoption agency, but I remember a friend who worked at Eastern. There were a lot of competition for kids. They've been sending out name cards in obstetrician office, hospitals, so OBGYN, yeah, and to call when they have a child. Yeah, and they would actually be giving some money for a child. She talked about, actually, there was a real, a person who really knew about adoption. I think she was the only one in Korea. She's in some park. She's no longer working. I think she's so tired of everything. But there were offices in the country, provinces, and they would be bringing a lot of children for intake. And, she would ask about each child, and some of the kids would, she would have questions. Is she really adoptable, or are you sure she should be going for adoption? And she would return the child, and she would come back with a different name again. And they would actually be, the agency I heard was actually giving incentives to workers who would intake a lot of kids. So there was a lot of competition among the agencies. And I remember, I didn't understand at the time, but I remember a woman sitting in front of our gate, Holt, every day asking for a child back. And she was, I think, I don't know if she was married, but she was separated from this man, and I guess she left the baby, and he gave the child away, and child was gone, and she was not told, so she was waiting. When I worked at Children's Home Society of San Jose, I also worked part-time at an adoption agency in the U.S., and that agency worked with SWS. There were two, one sibling, brother and sister in the U.S., adopted for 2 years, living in a family, and Korean birth parents wanted them back, and they were lost kids. They were not abandoned, or so there were many incidents like that where they were, agencies just grabbed or tried to send as many kids as they could.
I'll just add really quickly from the perspective of the Western countries, like America, particularly by the 80s, Korea in particular had such a good reputation as a sending country, in that if you were an American family wanting to adopt a child from abroad, Korea was one of the programs that you could get a child the fastest. You didn't have to wait very long. You didn't have to go to Korea to pick up the child. You could just get them at the airport in America. And you could also, you were more likely to get a very young, only a few months old, healthy infant, rather than like a toddler or older. So that made Korea's adoption program especially popular in the States.
So my next question is for Pastor Kim. You've worked in adoptee activism since 1993 in different places and degrees. In your experience, what are some of the most common challenges that adoptees face when they're trying to find their birth families?
It is known that adoption agencies kind of passive way to support the adoptees to help them to find their birth family. And many adoptees actually experienced about the difficulties to work with the adoption agencies, even including CAS. I think the most the basic hurdles or basic obstacles is not probably located in adoption agencies. It is located in the government, from my point of view. Because the Korean government is not actively working for the adoptees' right to reunite with the original family. It is written, the law, the special adoption law is written very clearly, but even they have lots of limitations. For example, privacy law, and also there is anyway. Even though adoption agencies are doing actively their best, still there is a lot of obstacles to find out where the location to find the location of birth family. But Korean government is actually do not have a sensitivity of the adoptees suffering, adoptees kind of wish, and they are not literally kind of the feeling and aware, having awareness. There is a lot of things I would like to say, but the main hurdle is the Korean government.
If I may play the devil's advocate here, the special adoption law was enacted in 2013 and in 2012, and the Korean Adoption Services, which is a government-run agency, worked to centralize a lot of the information and to make the services better for adoptees, at least on paper. So, you know, at least on paper, it seems like the government hasn't been doing nothing. And compared to 20 years ago, their sensitivity to the adoptee issue seems to have increased, but is it different for someone who's working in activism? So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The main part of the government in charge of the family search for adoptees is a social child welfare division of the Ministry of Social Welfare and Health. The people are changing every 2 years. Sometimes we have very good governmental officers, sometimes not. And that is the weakness of government. And the other part is the CAS, Korean Adoption Services, has actually no power at all, even not only power, but their sensitivity to feel the adoptees' wish to reunite with the family as really, really low, basically, as an institution. And adoption agencies are actually enjoying this kind of the, even though they are challenged by adoptees, but the CAS or the Social Welfare Health Ministry is not making any path to help them. If the path is well paved for the searching, then adoption agency has to follow to work hard for working hard. But there is lots of different hurdles, and they are always saying, "Hey, law is like this," and then they are acting actually passively. And also, it's nice for them because they have been practicing since 60 years to collecting the original family's record, but they did falsification, or they destroyed, or they multiplied, or they switched. If they are actively searching for the birth family. The information which they have been dealing is revealing what they have been doing, as how they are actually abusing the adoptees' right to have a right record. Actually, whole the system is a kind of abusing system. If they are actively trying to do, it's revealed what they have been wrongly done. That's why all the sectors, the social welfare health ministry, is not actually actively listening of the adoptees' wish, and also they are not actively recognizing this is a kind of human right abuse. That is the most important part of the hurdles.
Unfortunately, you know, we would love to hear from someone from the side that Pastor Kim is criticizing. And we have reached out to Eastern and Holt and people at Korean Adoption Service, which is the government-run agency, but they have all refused to participate. And this refusal is perhaps telling in that there is so much criticism against the agencies and the government, and they actually, to a degree, exacerbate it by refusing to participate in the discussion because it's so sensitive. They don't want to say something wrong, and their asses are on the line. So to transition that to Helen's question to Helen, no, is that, you know, the consistent criticism I hear when I talk to adoptee activists and when I'm talking to Caitlin is that, you know, these adoption agencies, the social workers there are incompetent or often unwilling to help adoptees. Now, this is different depending on, you know, the social worker that you end up with, and your luck in finding families can depend on your luck in finding the social worker. Do you think this criticism is valid? Because statistics show that not all adoptees are dissatisfied with adoption services.
Yeah, the reason why that adoptees have different experiences with the different social workers is that it's all left up to the individual social workers to become competent or not, because there's no training, no education. It's very puzzling and sad that there are you have the UN Child Rights Convention, you have the Hague Convention, and then all this adoption research, how adoption practice needs to be done, what values they should live up to. That's not studied or taught to social workers. So I think some social workers who are really good at their work are so because they work there on their own to learn about it, or from their experience they learn how to become more empathetic, and to maybe they've had some success stories that they that made them really learn how to work better. But especially those young, inexperienced social workers who have no training at all, no education at all, they just wonder, why are adoptees so what can you call it? Why do they want this trivial information? I mean, there's nothing. That's the kind of attitude they have, because they don't realize how even a little information can be so precious to the adoptee, because it's part of their life. Especially most adoptees don't have that information, any picture of the life they had before they were adopted. So they even want to hear if while counseling the mother cried. One girl, a 7-year-old girl in the U.S., that daughter of a friend, went through that grieving process for her parents, birth parents, and she cried. She wrote to, she asked her mom to write to Holt to get information. And she was a girl with a limb of a handicap. And she got a letter from Holt saying that her father was the one who came in and he cried when he gave her up. And she said, oh, he loved me. That was so relieving to her. So little information like that, or little thing that the mother or the father asked to be sent with the baby. You know, things like that are so important. And when I interview the workers or the birth moms recently, adoption workers don't seem to have any sensitivity to that, and that's something that they could learn from education and training.
So I guess there's a consensus about, lack of training and lack of sensitivity in social workers. But if you look at it from their perspective, social work in South Korea is often not the easiest job to have. There are high turnovers, pay is not always high, and a lot of the times you're just so absorbed in your daily administrative burdens that you don't have the time to think about the training, which is important. And I'm not trying to justify the social workers, but just trying to provide their perspective. Before we go into intermission, I'd like to ask a question that's directed to all three panelists. An important voice missing from our panel and also in mainstream narrative is that of the birth families, and especially the single mothers whose children were sometimes relinquished without their own consent. So I want to ask you guys, in your opinion, how does the social stigma in South Korea stop families from looking for the adoptees or meeting them when the adoptees reach out? Because a lot of the times, the reason why adoptees can't get this information about their parents is because the parents don't want them to have the information, or the adoptee, the agencies think that the parents don't want them to have this information. So how do you think the whole social stigma in South Korea plays out?
First, I'll say that there are some surveys and statistics about this where, especially in recent years since CAS was established, the government-run agency, because since CAS was established, they now have a vehicle through which they can start tracking some of the statistics in terms of how many adoptees are searching, what are the responses that they're getting when they send out when they try to contact birth parents, often through telegrams, they say. So actually the statistics say that, I guess I don't remember off the top of my head the exact breakdown, but they'll send a telegram to the birth family to try to get their consent in order to release the birth parents' information to the adoptee. And the smallest percentage is the birth parents who reply and say, and they give consent, they say yes, and then that sometimes relate to a reunion. The largest percentage is a no response. So not that they replied and said no, but that they simply never got a response. So whether it's because they never got the mail, or they just never replied, or it was the wrong address. I mean, they don't know, I don't think CAS keeps track of that. But what CAS tends to do is they tend to lump together the statistics of no reply and no, an answer of no, and they say, well, this is the number of families that don't give consent. So where in reality, it's a no reply is very different from a refusal, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. But also, I think in terms of stigma, from some of the stories I've heard from adoptees who have reunited, and also from my own birth family too, I think even in the case of parents who did not consent to the relinquishment of their children, they through various factors of how Korean society views them or how adoption is portrayed in Korean society, they think they don't have the right to search for their kids, or they think that that their adopted child will not want to meet them because they think they must hate me because I sent them away, or whatever, even if they didn't actually send them away. So I think that's a problem in that the birth families sometimes feel that they don't have the right to call themselves the parents of the adopted child anymore, even if it wasn't their choice. So that's one way in which it affects, I think.
I met a lot of actually original families who visited to adoption agency to know about the children who are alive or not. The basic question they have in their mind since long time, but usually they are going to the adoption agencies. Adoption agencies are very roughly saying that why you would like to find your child when you abandoned. Now you would like to know why. Kind of reaction of adoption agencies actually discouraging a lot for the original families request. Even though they have already inside of themselves, I have no dignity, no right to know about my child. I am a bad person to abandon my child. This is a kind of internally already discouraged. And going to adoption agency, again, they are punched by the adoption agencies. That is the basic experience of the original family. And anyway, socially, they are always hiding their whole stories. It means they never have kind of the courageous attitude to open, to speak out. That is the whole the situation, I think. Even they reveal those stories, then immediately probably the beaten by husband or other family members and kind of looking down and so on. All the stigmatization is existing, but especially adoption agency, the attitude has to be changed. When the mothers are coming, and adoption agents, social workers have a sensitivity, how much they would like to know about the death and life of their children. And then welcoming and kind of the process of the kind of the understanding, accepting, and then the showing them doing their best to locating the children and so on. Those part is a big missing part. And then these people can have probably, oh, my request is accepted by the adoption agencies. They need actually the person who is accepting, understanding of their concern and their worry and their kind of internal traumatic experience. That is one. Then how do we do? Training the adoption agency social worker? But the adoption agent social worker are under the captized by the past histories. Probably, my guess is raising a lot of voice in cultural venue, the making SNS or making the newspaper or small 5 minutes kind of the film. And so on. That there is probably it is necessary to reach these people that think different way, and also probably collecting the original mothers who are successfully passing through all the hurdles, probably.
And that's something that we should talk about more in the next half of the panel, about how adoption is talked about in the culture, in South Korean media and in schools, and what that says about how South Korea is dealing with its past. But, you know, that could be questions that you guys can ask the panelists too. Let's take a short break, maybe a 10-minute break, to just stand up, get some coffee, and if you want to use the bathroom, you have to, for men, you have to go to the first floor. Is that it? Basement, B1, and then the women, the first floor, and then just go halfway down the stairs, and there's a bathroom. So see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you for staying for the second half of the panel, which is when we're opening the floor to you guys. But I love hogging the floor so much that I'm going to ask one more question and then give the floor to you guys. So I guess the first question from me as an audience member is to Caitlin. You're currently part of a group of adoptees and lawyers who are trying to make revisions to the current law. So, like, you know, without going into too much detail about the adoption law. Can you give us a context on the law and why it hasn't been sufficient in helping adoptees find their families?
So I'll first give a quick disclaimer that I haven't been involved in this super long, so I'm not the most knowledgeable person about the special adoption law and everything that's going on. But I have been involved recently, and I've been starting to learn about it. So basically, the special adoption law was passed in 2011 and became effective in 2012. It was the first time that anything about birth family search was legally regulated. So it established CAS, the central agency that was supposed to kind of become kind of the one-stop centralized agency for birth family search and other post-adoption services. It also it basically established guidelines for birth family search that were not there before. So the good thing about that is that, I mean, the goal was for birth family search to stop being such kind of a random Russian roulette of which social worker you got that day, and there was supposed to be a set procedure that you're supposed to follow. So that's good, but the problem is that the agencies, and CAS too, they have taken kind of the liberty to interpret this law in the most narrow way possible, basically to make it as easy and convenient for them as possible. So they use this law to say, like, well, it's not in the law that I have to, actively go and check to see if somebody got the telegram we sent to with mothers. So, sorry, I can't do it because it's not in the law. So yes, that's one of the biggest problems in the law, is that it's pretty vague. It allows for pretty narrow interpretation. Okay, I'm trying not to go into too much of the nitty-gritty here, but because it's kind of complicated. But some of the things that adoptees are working on proposing for the new revisions, one of the most important ones is to expand the scope of the relatives in the birth family that the agencies are allowed to contact. So currently, when that law was written in 2011, it only specifies birth parents, so the mother or father. So even if the agency has some record of, say, a sibling or an aunt or uncle or a grandparent, in the past, they would sometimes contact those family members, but now that the law only specifies birth parents, even though, of course, it doesn't say you're not allowed to contact anybody but the birth parents, it only specifies birth parents. So the agencies take that and say, well, the law says we can only contact your birth parents, so sorry, we can't contact anybody else. And so even in cases of adoptees who have maybe met other people in their birth family before and simply don't have their contact information currently, they try to contact the agency to find them back, and they say, sorry, we can't give it to you, even if you've already met them before. So expanding the scope of relatives to the third degree of kinship, that's one of the main goals. Another one of the main goals is to establish a government-run database of DNA. So for the government to encourage, because there are databases for missing people, there are already some of those kinds of databases, but the goal is, and there are also a lot of adoptee activists who just independently are trying to get a lot of adoptees to get DNA tested. They make frequent trips to Korea to bring DNA kits from services like consumer, home-to-consumer services like 23andMe you may have heard of. So they're trying to bring those kits to Korea to get birth parents to get tested and create these databases, but the goal is for a government-run one to centralize all of this information. So those are two of the main things, as well as a bunch of provisions to prioritize family preservation first over adoption. I won't go too much into that now, but that's also another main goal of the revisions.
Thank you. Who would like to take the mic for the first question? And before you ask the question, can you please introduce yourself, and thank you.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Vince Mua. I was, up until very recently, the college counselor at Seoul Global High School, which is a public high school here. And my area of research and interest is in race and ethnic relations and how that forms identity. And so my first question, revolves more so around identity rather than politics or issues therein of politics. So this is quite a lengthy question, so I'm sorry. I'm going to preface it with that. But we often see that within multicultural mixed or HAPA communities in America, specifically Asian and Caucasian, that the construction of personal identity is oftentimes very much so dictated by hegemonic powers that are kind of favor more of a white narrative. And for adoptees, who from my observations are oftentimes adopted into white, Caucasian, very religious families, I was just interested whether or not, was it difficult for you to, this is to Caitlin, was it difficult for you to navigate the realms of race, ethnicity, and language in growing up in the Midwest? And likewise, if you are willing to share, did you find, how did you kind of traverse that to find your identity? Because I don't want to be presumptuous in assuming that you consider yourself Asian American or Korean American or anything like that. So yeah, that would be wonderful to hear.
Thanks, that's a great question. I guess I'll preface by saying that some of the graduate research, some of the research I did in graduate school was about discourse analysis, so critical discourse studies, studying how the narrative of adoption is constructed or how the narrative of adoption both creates and maintains power structures within the actors involved in adoption. So adoption agencies, adoptive parents, birth families, adoptees. And as you can probably guess, most of the power lies in the hands of agencies and usually white adoptive parents, whereas adoptees and birth families, usually of color, are suppressed in the narrative. So that's, I guess that's just a background on some of the lenses I've looked at this kind of issue. And so, yes, it's certainly, especially in the case of adoption, because it's a white family with a non-white child, particularly the further back you go. I mean, it's a little different these days with people who are still adopting now, but especially in the 80s, the 70s, the peak of adoption, the adoptive parents were told, just treat the child like it's your own. Just totally assimilate them. There's no need to tell them about anything about where they came from. Just pretend like they're your own child. And so it's like we call it the colorblind rhetoric, right? So adoptive parents will say things like, well, I don't see you as Asian. I just see you as, I don't see us as different. You're just my daughter. You're just my son. And so for me personally, that's, I guess I won't say it was difficult growing up, but that's because I lived in a community where everybody was so blissfully unaware of race and racialization that I don't think I really was racialized at all. I don't even really have a lot of memories of people, making racist jokes about being Asian because I really just think people didn't think about it. So it's a weird kind of color blindness, a weird kind of whitewashing that I guess was good in that there was I didn't suffer from a lot of bullying, but also not good in that I had zero connection to anything Korean or Asian or anything but these white people I grew up with. So for me personally, I guess, and even through college, I went to university in not very far from home. It was a very predominantly white school, so even then I really didn't learn a lot about these kinds of issues, or until I came to Korea. I came to Korea right after I graduated from undergrad. So I kind of jumped in with both feet, I guess, into exploring my own identity as a Korean, as an Asian American. So it was kind of an immersive way to approach it, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. We can talk about it later if you want. But yeah, but it's very, very different for everybody. And especially, I mean, I think adoptive parents in the States, at least, in some cases, not in all cases, but there are some efforts to educate adoptive parents more about this. There's a big push, certainly from adoptees too, saying that if people who are considering adopting, they need to consider, would you move to a different city in order to be near more people of color? Would you move somewhere so that your child can go to a school where there are more people of color? So that's that's becoming, it's entering the radar more than it was in the past, certainly, but it is still a big issue.
Thanks. My name's Catherine Kim Bradkey, and I am a first wave Korean adoptee. I'm also a co-founder of 325 Camera, which is an organization whose mission it is to help reunite Korean adoptees with biological family through the use of DNA. So she mentioned a little earlier about people bringing DNA kits to Korea, and that's our organization. Anyway, my question to you, Caitlin, or any of the panel members actually, it had been mentioned earlier that perhaps 70% of Korean adoptees actually do birth search, and I don't know how accurate that figure is, and you mentioned you yourself that you'd reconnected with your biological family. It was interesting to me last night because I was at a small adoptee gathering. A few of those in this room were there as well, but there were at least four adoptees at this club last night who'd been reunited with biological family, and they're not all happy stories. So I'm just wondering, are there statistics that are tracking the data on those who are reunited, and what the outcomes of those stories might be or are?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess first to start with the statistics that we mentioned earlier, those were from a report released by CAS in 2013, and I need to look at it again to see how they collected their sample, but for that study, they surveyed, it was about 1,000 adoptees. I think they may have gotten, I can't recall for sure, I think it may have come from like one of the gatherings, yeah, right? So they polled people there. I don't know how exactly they got those 1,000 people, but so that was it was, especially when you consider that there's 200,000 some adoptees, right? That's a pretty small sample size. So it was of those 1,000, like 22 people, 71% had attempted to search. I think it was 28% had reunited. We were actually talking about this earlier because my personal hunch, I don't really have much to prove this, but my personal hunch, having also done this oral history project where I interviewed 30 adoptees, and of them, I think it was like 40% had reunited. So that's quite high, because the general statistics for reunion, which again come from usually relatively small sample sizes, are pretty low. So the lowest number was from 2006. It estimated about 2.7% reunite. Recent years, again, since CAS has been established, they can track, since 2012, so many thousand adoptees have requested their records to start a search, and of those, it's like 6,000 or 7,000 people, they say, I think it's up to about 18% reunite. But that's, again, only from a certain number of years. So there's not a lot of good data out there about that. And I am really not sure of the way to get it, since there's such a large amount of adoptees spread all over the world. And my personal hunch is that adoptees who have reunited are maybe just more likely to be aware of adoption or adoptee organizations. They're more likely to have some kind of contact with an adoption agency. So they're maybe just more likely to hear about these kinds of surveys, trying to get this kind of data. And especially for a study like the one that I did, which was oral history, I got a lot of when people were telling me their stories, they would say things like, oh, I hope my story was like interesting enough for you, or for those, because my study was open to people from any stage of the search, whether or not they had reunited or whether or not they had even searched. But the people who didn't search, especially, they would say things like, well, is it really okay for me to participate in this because I haven't even searched yet? So are you sure you want me to tell your story? I'm like, yes, that's the point. So I kind of wonder, there is a certain reason why adoptees who have reunited are more likely to just participate in these kinds of surveys. I don't know. So that's, it's a question of data that I don't really know how to answer. But, and then the second part of your question, I'm sorry, can you? Oh, about reunion, yes. 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 Yeah, that's another actually a big gap in adoptee research is that there's not much about reunion. Because again, I reference a lot this kind of like dominant narrative around adoption. Reunion is seen as like the end goal of like the happy ending, right? Like if you're one of the lucky people who manages to find your birth family, you won the game. Like you did it. So nobody or not no like very few people think to follow up on that and talk about all the complexities of trying to build a relationship with this family that you found after decades probably, right? When there's a language barrier, when there are cultural barriers, when there's a geographical barrier, you maybe can only see them once or twice every few years. So that's, yeah, it's a big gap in adoption research. There's no I have a friend who is an adoptee scholar who has done some research just on, she's a communication scholar, so she's done some research on the way adoptees talk about their birth families and the way that they talk with their birth families, the language that they use. But there's not anything significant that I know of about kind of following up with the reunion process and how many of them would call them happy, it's hard to kind of simplify it to those kinds of terms. But yeah, so that's a big need in the adoption research community now.
Hi, I'm Kim Gamble. I'm with Stars and Stripes newspaper, but just here is me. Just following up on that, I'm curious, because I also have wondered about that. I think a lot of people here probably know there was a podcast by Kaomi Getz, who was here, and she interviewed a lot of adoptees. And several of them, I think, I was always interested, talked about the same, that they had a negative experience when they contacted their birth parents because of the social stigma sometimes that you were talking about earlier. And so that, you talked about the 70%, according to this study, of adoptees who have sought out. Are there any statistics about reaching out to try to find their, because that would be one way of measuring, what the mood is here, how much birth families actually want to find people are receptive to adoptees who reach out to them. I'm just curious if there's any research about that.
Anyway, there is, I think, no kind of research has been done for the how many birth families are looking for their children. I have to say there is no, as far as I know, there is no statistics first. And second point, what I would like to say, there is a adoptees searching process as more is an active process, and the birth family process to searching their children, I have to say, more passive. Passive means they do not have any willingness to do, but they are actually suppressed by social stigma that they are not qualified even to qualified personality to would like to know the child's life, because they are so kind of the immoral way or inhuman way sending away the children. They are not a person of responsible. That's why I would like to, maybe it's not the answer, but the Korean birth family is silent. But inside of themselves, a huge kind of the dynamic inside to know the people, the children's life. That's why the anyway the research has to be done too. But at the same time, the Korean society has to put kind of the I wish actually the cars, for example, as a putting kind of advertisement or a kind of campaign to the KTX or to the subway. There are a lot of adopted people looking for you. Those kind of information is actually kind of the opening the people. Hey, the Korean government or Korean society is supporting us when we are looking for. Even those kind of the encouragement by the society, by the government, as urgent necessarily. That is what I would to answer. Not answer, but this comment.
Really quick, I'll also mention that there are a lot of stories of adoptees who reunite with their birth parents and they later discover that their birth parents did actively search for them. They tried to go to the agency and ask, and the agency would lie to them and say, for example, oh, your child was sent to the Netherlands when actually they were sent to America. Or they will tell them, oh, sorry, according to the law of the country your kid was sent to, the adoptee has to look for you first. You're not allowed to look for them when there's really no such law. So that happens a lot as well. No data, no statistics, but there are lots of just personal reports of that.
Just to follow up on the stigma in South Korea, according to the study that we've been citing today, the 2013 study, the survey on international Korean adoptees by the Korean Institute for Health and Social Affairs, just to put that on the record, they also did a survey of 1,000 or so South Koreans and what their perceptions toward adoption was like, and some of them were positive, 20% or so. An overwhelming percentage was either indifferent or felt negative towards it. Can you talk a little bit more about the stigma in South Korea and also how some people actually think that adopting kids outside of Korea or to other families is actually a good thing? It's not a human rights abuse. It's a good thing. They see it as philanthropy.
You mean society's attitude? Yeah. I think whenever adoptees come to search, they often talk about, or when we talk about the cons of overseas adoption, people would talk about, what about those kids in the institution? Isn't it better for kids to live with a family than, live in institutions? That's always the rationale, the reason. They never talk about preserving the family, how you could help the original family not to even send to the child welfare institution. And I think the child welfare policy in Korea is so strange. It's so fragmented that it's easier to give up your child than to raise your child.
Can you give us an example of how it's strange?
Well, with respect to adoption, just if you compare how much support the unmarried mothers are given in comparison to adopted families, you could see the contrast. For unmarried mothers to get support of 150,000, well, it's not even 150. You have to be, if you are younger, you get a little more money. If you're older, you don't get the money. You have to be under a certain income level to be eligible. Yeah, there's so many requirements. And even then, it's the most you can receive is 150,000 won a month, up to age 12. With adoptive families, you're given 150,000 won per month, regardless of income. You're given free medical. You're given support for psychological treatment of 200,000 won a month. And they're asking for even college tuition now. and the age limit is 16, not 12. So you could see the contrast there. It's very easy for unmarried mothers or single families to give up children. and institutions, group homes, and foster care, they all want children to maintain their programs. So that's how it is. And I just going back to Kathleen's question about the complexity after they unite. I mean, just that situation is complex enough. You know, you are coming, as Caitlin said, you're coming from very different culture. Even though you're of the same blood, you are two very different people. And Korean parents, especially when there was this real increase of overseas adoption, I think often thought that sending your child overseas for adoption was like sending your child to get overseas to get a good education. So their concept, this even with Korean adoptive families, how they view adoption is very strange. It's not. It's very mixed. I think oftentimes they don't realize it's a real cutoff of legal relationship, that you, at least legally, you're no longer parents and children. They just think that they are temporarily sending, although they feel very guilty about it and all that, oftentimes when they reunite, they think that they're back to their original family. And I've heard some adoptees saying some families expect this adoptee to take the responsibility of being an oldest child and take care of the finances of the family, and wish that they would take the rest of the family to the United States. Or even my students, before we have an adoptee come and talk, they often think, oh, they would look in, they hear about adoptees talking in English on TV and say, oh, why didn't my parents send me abroad as an adoptee? They think it's a good thing. They don't realize the complexities of it.
Oh, sorry. I had a question. Oh, go ahead. No. I wanted to give it to you. Sorry.
My name is Maria Savage. I'm also an adoptee and one of the people that has DNA kits in Korea. My question is for Pastor Kim or Helen. Talking about adoption in a modern context in Korea, you just mentioned not understanding the complexities, and I was curious about ways we can encourage the dialogue within modern Korea between adoptees, Korean people, first families, and then also the social workers who still don't have, it sounds like, training about current or past adoption issues.
Actually, I couldn't understand what she is raising the questions. I have to say like this. I'm sorry, it's my reality. The question, one more clear.
I'm curious about how we can encourage talking about adoption in a modern context. Adoptees, people, social workers, and also what if there are any initiatives what avenues we can take to
Probably I have to say how the Korean society solve the problems in relation with adoptions. I think there is the only way. I have to say, the adoptee society who return to Korea, or any building up the worldwide level of network, and then raising the voice. Without doing this, I'm so sorry to challenge the Korean society to be different or dialogue. But first, it's very important that the people themselves, we would like to start to make our voice to be listened in Korean society. That is one process. Second one, for example, you have to, for example, many people are acting, Pastor Kim is a kind of, the ally for bring the voice to Korean society. I think the most important thing, you have to kick me out like myself first. No, we are saying by ourselves. We wouldn't like to mediate by the people. They could be our partner, but still the voice has to be directly delivered to Korean society. It means the initiative, I hope, comes from the adopted people themselves. It means if you would like to bring your voice, you need actually material, financial power too. Not only your willingness, your experience, but how do we challenge Korean society? Even the sensitivity level, without dialogue, you cannot increasing the sensitivity level of the government. This is not simply the kind of philanthropy, or it's not simply a merciful, loving history. It is a basic notion of Korean society. We did philanthropy, but it's not. Then people have no actually awareness about it's not a philanthropy, it is human right abuse. That's why I would like to say mobilizing the power for the human right of the, anyway, I'm asking too much, but the basic direction is somebody who would like to have a dialogue. Who is starting to the dialogue? Social worker themselves is passive, always defensive. Korean government people always defensive and passive, not to listen. Only they have interested in voyeurism, in the drama, or it's wonderful stories, fantasy. And this is only, the kind of how do I say, substance is making you actually not to face the reality. That's why let the Korean society to have a dialogue need actually to the initiative comes from the adopted people. Hey, I want to say something to you. Why don't you to come to us and sitting together, have a talk, and then by doing this, probably the way you can raise the kind of the awareness or sensitivity about the adoption. As I'm thinking, actually, we have been working, but it is such a. I'm feeling personally, have been working so much, but no result. It's so hard. Even I'm personally, I have kind of role to mediate a little bit, but it failed. Very clearly, it failed. Because I do not know well. I couldn't understand even from you what you are saying. I cannot capturizing all the contents which is have to delivered. I'm missing a lot.
Just to clarify, when you're saying you're mediating between the adoptees and the government, right? Okay. Would you like to elaborate on that, or should we go to the next question? Okay. So, is it possible to keep it short? Because of time limitations, we have to speed it up a little. Thank you.
The dilemma or the most difficult part of working in the field of adoption is in Korea, especially, everybody thinks adoption is a wonderful thing. I was presenting this proposal to come up with this post-adoption counseling services manual, and these two people who were judges, who came as judges, they're social work professors, and they said after I presented said, when I first came, I just was wondering, why do we need this manual? Adoption is such a wonderful thing. Why do we need this services? That's how they think. That's how happy and wonderful adoption is to most people.
It's the social perceptions seem to be more complex than I think. It's not just simply a stigma. There's a sort of pride in having done philanthropy, but at the same time, the mothers and the families are stigmatized for having, adopted kids out. And then there's also kind of a silence when it comes to the adoptees who are coming back to look for their birth parents. Like, this is not discussed very often in South Korean media or in schools. But maybe this is something that we can talk about more after the panel is over. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we only have time for one last question. And there was someone at the back who was raising her hand for a while, so.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Pak. I'm with a new organization that Caitlin is a part of as well, Solidarity and Political Engagement of Adoptees in Korea. It's called SPEAK because that's too much to say. And my question is for Dr. No. What kind of training is typical for social workers? Now and in the past when you used to work at the agencies, I think I heard in the past a bachelor's degree was sufficient, or a short course to get a certificate, like what we get to teach English after a couple hours, Yes,
bachelor's, when I was at Holt, most of us were graduate of social work department, but then right before I left, we had like 30 people the management level who had no experience, nothing, just joined, and they were paid a lot. And also, there was really no requirement. So I'm sure after that, there were people who had no social work background who were doing social work. There was no training, as I said. Now, after the special adoption law, they're required to get 8 hours every year, 8 hours. And I looked at the content, half of them is about administration, very little about adoption issues, 4 for management level. And they talk about how to increase adoption. And I was so surprised at one of their PPTs, which said special adoption law increases child abandonment in baby box. That was part of the education that they were getting. So this is the situation, yeah.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. It's a pretty hot day, and it's actually hotter here because of all the windows. I hope you guys had an interesting time, and for any further questions or discussions, you're free to use the space until maybe, what time is it right now? Maybe 3:30, 3:40, we'll leave the space open for you. So thank you so much for coming, and please give a round of applause to the panelists.